Today we're going to talk about the perception of turf grasses. Areas where turf grasses are used, golf courses, athletic fields, lawns, parks, those turf grass areas often can have a negative perception in the minds of people. There's a number of reasons for those. There's a number of misguided or misinformed areas of those negative perceptions. So today we're going to talk about where those perceptions come from and examine that concept of how perceptions are formed and what can be done to improve a perception so that if you're in the field working as a turfgrass manager, you have an understanding of why somebody might have a negative perception of what you do, and also have some tools about which you can strive to change that negative perception. Oftentimes, those negative perceptions are tied to some emotional feeling or some emotional consideration. Rarely is the rational evaluation of information done, and so when that takes place and we're relying on feelings and emotional, tapping into the emotional side of folks, what ends up happening is trying to change their minds is extraordinarily difficult. And so in the next few minutes we're going to talk about how those perceptions are formed and what can be done to change that. So let's talk about negative perceptions. I've posted a number of videos on the Blackboard Learn site for you to view and to examine some of the questions that we're going to pose in the lecture today and then in class in our discussion. Oftentimes, one of the big negative perceptions that you hear folks talk about is how a turfgrass area is sterile, that there's nothing living in that area. Well, first, the turfgrasses are living, but if you were to examine a turfgrass and to zoom in on a turfgrass, or to look at the root system of a turfgrass, you would find literally billions of microorganisms that are living on the surface of the leaves of the turfgrass plant or in the rhizosphere of the root system of the turfgrass plant. It's home to literally billions of different organisms that decompose the organic matter and provide nutrients to that system, and also detoxify other things that come into contact with that turfgrass area. So the idea of the sterility or the sterile environment is often a result of the chemical use that is perceived to be done on turfgrass areas. And there's no doubt that in high-use, high-end facilities where turfgrasses are pushed to their edge of adaptation, that an increase in chemical use is oftentimes something that happens. However, what is also done in those cases is that those turfgrass areas are also, or turfgrass chemicals are also used to make sure that that area performs as good as it possibly can perform. And so the use of those products to improve the quality of the turf at the rates that are used is oftentimes much lower than is perceived to be used. The second negative perception that turf grasses often receive is that of a polluter, and that's mostly due to the chemical use, but also fertilizer use. There's a belief that the fertilizer that's applied to turf grasses runs straight through the system and out into rivers and streams where it can be a problem, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen. The reality of that is that most of the fertility that is applied to a turfgrass area is absorbed by the turfgrasses and used as part of their food sources. There's been lots of research to present that, but the perception of those negative connotations of being a polluter are very difficult to change with data by themselves. So that's a challenge as well. Another area of negative perception is this idea of urban sprawl. Because of the suburban development that has taken place, and oftentimes in suburban developments with lots of homes, there's lots of lawns. So there's a perception that turf grasses lead to urban sprawl. There's also a negative perception that turf grasses are a large user of water, particularly golf courses, but also home lawns. And so when we're in a drought situation like Georgia was in several years ago, home lawn use and golf course use of water is often restricted. That's mostly based on a perception those areas use lots of water. The reality is different than that. But again, data doesn't trump that perception, and we're going to talk about how to change that. Finally, another negative perception is that turf grasses result in an increase in carbon dioxide and contribute to climate change. This is mostly due to the belief that the equipment that is used to maintain turf grasses is a major contributor to that greenhouse gas emission. However, the equipment manufacturers have improved efficiencies and made motors and engines much more efficient, quieter, and better users of the fuel that they use in order to reduce the impact of this. But again, this is a perception that doesn't fit with the reality. So let's talk about the positive side of the perceptions for turf grasses. There's another video that's posted on the Blackboard Learn site that talks about the positive impacts of turf grasses. There's been much research done that shows that turf grasses prevent erosion and reduce soil movement. In fact, in most agricultural areas, turf grasses are used to stop erosion and soil movement in areas called buffer strips, in fields where drain areas go to move water off of the agricultural fields and into a water stream, river, or lake. And oftentimes, turf grasses are planted in those drainage ways to reduce water flow, to capture nutrients, and to do all the things that oftentimes the negative perceptions suggest that turf grasses don't do. Turf grasses have also been shown to provide cooler environments, reducing the need for air conditioning in a home by many times. And this is something that you'll view when you look at the video on Blackboard. Also, with that reduction in heating needs, there's also, because it's a transpiring and respiring plant, there's also a reduction in overall temperature on average. In fact, Palm Springs, over the course of the last 50 years, has dropped their average temperature by many degrees Fahrenheit as a result of a reduction in the heat island effect, where areas of impervious surface heat up and hold their heat and then give that heat back. And so the areas are cooler as a result of turf grass use. Turf grasses are also quite water efficient. A recent study has shown that the municipal water supply of a state, the golf courses and turf grass areas, took up just 0.2% of the water supply. There's a belief that it's a huge amount, but the number one users of water are actually the municipal sewage and drainage districts. Now, I'm not saying we should get rid of sewage and drainage, but it's important to keep this perspective that sewage and drainage is necessary, but is also a major user of water. In Atlanta, the Dasani bottling plant for bottled water. Have you ever had a bottled water? One of the largest users of water in the Atlanta area, not the home lawns and golf courses. So this idea that turf grasses are very water efficient, and in fact turf grass managers learn ways and methods to reduce water use, it's critically important that we recognize that this is an area where turf grasses can actually provide a benefit rather than being a negative. We've already talked about the idea of recreation in other videos, but this idea of using recreation to fight obesity and provide a social good is something that is important to recognize and a positive benefit of turf grass. And then finally, the turf grasses, because of their roots and their density of plant material, oftentimes reduces the impact from chemical use. They increase the uptake of stray chemicals and reduce the runoff of drainage water, as we talked about with the buffer strips and preventing erosion and capturing those nutrients and chemicals before they make their way into a water area. So how are perceptions formed? I think it's important to consider how perceptions are formed if we're going to do anything about how we change those perceptions and consider why somebody might have a perception of how turf grasses are used. Well, perceptions are formed through two areas. The first being experience, that of you and others. Most of those experiences then form a kind of a beginning impression of what something is. And those experiences begin to happen as soon as we're born. So many of these experiences can be firmly entrenched long before we even recognize that we have them. In the case of turf grasses, most people are from urban and suburban areas. They're not from rural areas that are exposed to agriculture and agricultural production and have an understanding of using various tools to produce plants, to produce materials, to produce food. So they don't have an understanding of those agricultural systems. And then the second thing that is needed for a perception to be formed is information. Now, information can be gotten from an informal experience, or it can be formal information that is disseminated through video or media or writing or talking to somebody. But information can be good or bad. And how many times have you come into contact with information that's bad information, and it leads you to have an experience that maybe isn't the most positive experience you've had, and then looking back, you have a bad perception of that situation, when for somebody else it might have been a good experience and they got good information about that very same event or happening. So it's important to think about the good and bad information and consider how much of this information is readily available. One of the challenges that turfgrass managers and the turfgrass industry has is making information readily available and coupling that to experiences that are positive with respect to turf grasses. Because of the experience plus the information then forming a perception, this makes for a very strong, deeply held belief or deeply held bond. And that's extremely difficult to change. So data doesn't help. Why do you think that might be? Why do you think if we just provided more data or made information more readily accessible, we'd be able to change what somebody thinks about a particular area of turfgrass management? Well, the answer is that if we have to have an experience and information, then providing the information isn't enough. We also have to provide a positive experience for somebody to form that positive perception. They need to get that piece of information and connect it with a positive experience in order to develop a positive perception of the particular piece of information or turfgrass area that we're talking about, that we want them to have a positive perception. So what often happens as a result is misdirection and disconnected mindsets that ultimately result in a thinking that turfgrass is bad. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for us, it's something that we really shouldn't have around. And that's a prevalent perception, and one that we as an industry have to consider how we go about changing. So we have several videos on the Blackboard site that I'd like you to take a look at. And I'd like you to do that and consider this question here. How does the perception of the dairy farm differ from a turfgrass area? We're going to talk about that in class. The same group filmed those two videos that are on the Blackboard site. One about a dairy farm, and it's a very positive exposition of the dairy farm's operation. And then there's a number of negative perception videos from that same group talking about turfgrass and the impact turfgrass has on the environment. So I'd like you to consider the elements of the dairy farm film and translate those into how you might use those elements from a turfgrass perspective. Then finally, how do we go about changing the perceptions of turf and turfgrass use, which is something that we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about in class this next time.